private education group Advtech reported an increase in full-year profit as greater enrollment and the growing demand for quality education lifted revenue. The company, which owns private schools Crawford International, Trinity House and Pinnacle, as well as tertiary education institutions such as Vega, Varsity College and Rosebank College, said total enrollments across the group advanced 5.1% to 88,631. To talk to us a little bit more about the numbers, we are joined by Roy Douglas, who is the CEO of Advtech. Roy, thank you so much for your time. Take us into, I suppose, when you look back at the year that was, when it comes to the performance of the different divisions within Advtech, as well as the various segments.
And we're very pleased because we've had a strong performance right across the board, which is very encouraging. I think our schools business in South Africa, which of course has a very well-established portfolio, we're seeing continued growth despite the very difficult socio-economic environment and the significant pressure that consumers are under. So our growth across the board in all of our brands was very encouraging. We've been on a program for a couple of years now of restructuring, reorganizing to make sure that we eliminate any wastage or duplicate effort in our schools group. And we've actually very pleased with the fact that our margins in that area are in fact enhancing and growing, and that's been a key objective for us. So that was good. The rest of schools Africa businesses, very encouraging growth, strong growth and profitability too, as they're really demonstrating the potential that we have there. So we're very encouraged that we have this balance of a strong local portfolio with a really sound base here in our home market and good growth opportunities on the rest of the continent, which I think augurs well for our schools division going forward. Tertiary put in another very consistent performance. We've had a number of years now of good performance from that division, and it continues on that trend with good underlying growth, excellent operational performance. So we're pleased there. And of course, our resourcing business, which is the smaller component of our organization, the big success story there is our diversification into different markets and different geographies across the continent, which is paying handsome dividends for us. So all in all, a really pleasing set of results from Advtech.
A lot of the CEOs who've reported results, at least over the past few weeks, have characterized this environment as quite tough against a backdrop of rising inflation and interest rates. What is your sense of the South African consumer, especially the parents of the students and pupils who are enrolled at your institutions?
I think there is absolutely no denying, and I think it's very well documented, the enormous pressure that South African consumers are experiencing in terms of the poor level of economic growth, high levels of inflation that are now affecting every single one of us. And so we understand, in essence, the pressure. On the other hand, I think parents worldwide and particularly here and across the continent of Africa understand that real quality education is an absolute imperative for their children in order for them to be globally competitive and really puts them in good stead comparatively in a sense of the tougher the economic circumstances. So I think parents will make the most amazing sacrifices to ensure that their children receive the best possible education they can. And for that reason, education has always been considered a relatively good defensive stock. It just so happens that with some of the other market circumstances, and particularly here and among the rest of the continent, that there is also good demand. Unfortunately, that demand is strongly linked to affordability, which is why we've placed so much emphasis on what we call educational productivity, which is the elimination of waste and duplication, the extraction of value from the consolidation of transaction and processing areas in our business, and trying to leverage our scale as best we can so that we can keep price increases to at or below inflation, which we've been very successful at doing over the last few years, and to ensure that we're really delivering true value to parents. If they perceive value in the quality of education, then I think parents will continue to make enormous sacrifices to do the best they can for their children.
At your interim results presentation, you did mention that the Minister of Higher Education had published draft regulations setting out the criteria to qualify as a university. Where are we with that?
Yeah, well, I'm pleased to say that there were a set of draft criteria that were published. They were a broad framework, perhaps, and I'm pleased to report that we're working very closely with the Department of Higher Education, with the feedback that was received from the publication of those initial parameters. And I'm hopeful that we will be able to make some very good progress and that our students will enjoy what I believe is their right, in the sense is that they have a qualification which is the equivalent to that which is in the public system through the unitary accrediting system that exists in South Africa. And therefore, our students should also be able to indicate that they were at a university, because to all intents and purposes, and in every other respect, that's exactly what we are. We just haven't been able to use the name. So we're pleased there is progress, and we're working with the Department of Higher Education in that area.
Before I let you go, what will you and the team be focusing on for the rest of the year?
Very much what we have been over the last few years, which is in fact making sure that we are as efficient and as effective as we possibly can, that we control all unnecessary areas of costs to absolute minimums, and that we continue to offer the very best value we can. We appreciate that these are tough times for consumers, particularly here in South Africa, and so our focus on educational productivity is absolute and clear. And I think we've had some good successes in the past, and we're looking forward to continuing with those initiatives. We are also looking at other opportunities in the African market across the continent, which we believe do represent good opportunity for us, but we will make cautious and careful and considered investment decisions. But if the potential which is demonstrated in these results for our Africa business, then that's an exciting future for us too.
Roy, thank you so much for your time. That is Roy Douglas, who is the CEO of Advtech, taking us through the year that was. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll have a look at the markets principle. Well, we're not going to be taking that break after all, but let's have a look at how markets are performing. We are seeing a weaker rand, and this is on the back of some of the mixed sentiment that we are seeing as the JSE appears a little bit firmer compared to some of its fears. However, sentiment is still around what is happening when it comes to the global banking sector. Concerns are still lingering when it comes to where we are seeing the stability of the European banking sector, given what we've seen with Deutsche Bank's shares falling more than 11% in Europe on Friday. However, to talk to us and unpack what we can expect in the next coming few days, especially as those concerns seem to linger, we are joined by Michael Traherne, who is from Rand Swiss. Michael, thank you so much for your time. I mean, I gave a little bit of a background in terms of where sentiment is sitting right now. The concern is still that global banking sector crisis. But how are you assessing things given some of the numbers that are coming through on your screen right now?
Yeah, afternoon, Nastasia. Particularly in European and US markets, things seem to have settled down over the weekend. We see that First Investment Bank in the US, which was on its knees, has now been bought out by a competitor. And that seems to settle the nerves of many people. Obviously, we still have the backing of the Fed saying that they will do what it takes to keep these banks alive. So we're seeing US and European markets doing well at the moment. Unfortunately, Chinese and Asian markets have been struggling this morning due to concerns around Chinese property sector and their companies linked to that sector.
A little bit earlier on, you would have caught a bit of that Advtech results interview, but what did you make of the numbers?
Yeah, Advtech numbers looking really, really strong. What particularly stood out was how well the rest of Africa schools division is doing. Even though it's still a small part of the group, they managed to grow that nicely. I think they're up 60% from the rest of Africa group. And that's effectively, when it comes to schooling, you spend a lot of money to build a campus, and you've got a lot of fixed costs related to that campus. And it means that every extra pupil that you add, all that does is that adds to the profits and doesn't add much to the extra costs. And what Advtech's seeing now is a good use of all of their schooling facilities as they approach about an 80% enrollment rate across the group. And that's seeing strong revenue growth and strong profit growth. And we see the shares up 1.5% this afternoon.
On the back of what you've just said now, was the education space something that you found attractive, the South African education space?
I think it depends where you're sitting in it. Advtech's in a nice area where they don't have too many schools. Their schools aren't overly expensive. They have seen in the past where immigration has hurt enrollment figures. but they seem to have bounced back from that, and they're seeing an increase in enrollment, and that's what you want to see. I think your very high-end schools where people can afford to immigrate, those schools have been hit very hard, but Advtech seems to be in a well-placed niche where they're not having that problem.
When we look at what is happening with this mini banking crisis, as some have dubbed it, versus what we saw in 2008, what's the difference here?
Yeah, I think the major difference here is these banks are struggling with liquidity. So they've got assets backing your cash, but they're struggling to turn those assets into cash. Those assets still have value. In 2008, the bank's assets didn't have value. They had mortgage-backed securities and properties that were effectively worth zero. So people who needed their money out, the banks didn't have assets to back that money, and that's why those banks failed. This time around, it's just a problem. It's a liquidity problem, less so a solvency problem. So it's a very different type of crisis. And the current crisis we're in is definitely more manageable, less likely to spread to become a global financial crisis like we saw in 2008.
When you look at the concerns out of the, when it comes to the European banking side, as well as some aspects from the US side, are there unanswered questions for you over the past couple of weeks, and what are they?
Yeah, I think the main one is how did we get to this point so quickly? You would think that the overall problem here is that management put the money in the wrong places that wasn't liquid enough. And as the environment changed so quickly, they were caught wrong-footed. And I suppose the question is, how did we get to that point this quickly? It does mean that expect a lot more regulation going forward for global banks. And that just makes these banks even less investable, a lot harder. Regulation means more costs, and it makes banks even less attractive as an investment.
As we wrap up, a key event that you're paying attention to for the rest of the week?
Yeah, US GDP and unemployment figure on Thursday, and then revised CPI numbers on Friday. I think those are going to drive markets for the next week or two.
All right, Michael, thank you so much for your time. That is Michael Traherne from Advtech Asset Management. And in addition to some of the events that he's paying attention to, I'll be looking at the Reserve Bank interest rate announcement this coming Thursday to find out where exactly are we sitting when it comes to those interest rates. But we'll also be paying attention to what is unfolding when it comes to that banking crisis. However, that is it for me. When we come back, we'll have more news for you, so stay tuned.